If you watched our reviews of the R1 and R3 Novas last year, you'll know how much I like the way these paddles play. Now Ronbus has decided to add that unique technology to their R2 shape. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So when I reviewed those two Novas last year, it was the first time I'd played with paddles that had this sort of adaptive playability to them. Of course, now this has become almost imperative to a new paddle's playability. Kevlar does it, titanium too, and foam, while it may be a little controversial, is also very adaptive in its own right. When I say adaptive, I mean that the paddles can actually respond differently to different types of shots. The best ones will add power when you want it, but then also provide more softness when you're not going big. I've actually written an article about all these various technologies, and you can check that out on our website, but I'll also probably turn it into a video in the near future because they are all quite unique and very interesting. Out of all of them though, the Nova technology may be my favorite. The R3 Nova was actually my paddle of choice for a very long time, so I'll go over all that tech in a second. But before we get into any of that, let me remind you that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So let's talk a little bit about the technology going on inside the R2 Nova, because I'm a huge fan of the concept behind it, and I think it translates almost perfectly to playability on court. The Novas have what Ronbus is calling their grid pattern technology. Instead of a raw carbon sheet wrapping around the edges, they've cut it into a grid, which is still one piece, but obviously with space because it's a grid. That grid pattern does two very important things. One, it allows air to escape during the molding process, which is crucial to stopping potential core crushing. Core crushing happens if, during the thermoform process, air bubbles are caught in the paddle as everything presses together. Allowing space for that air to leave is genius, and we've never seen a core crushed Nova. So the grid pattern provides a huge durability benefit, but perhaps more important is the effect it has on playability. As you can imagine, the space that comes from the grid pattern makes for a very different feel on contact. While that grid pattern is still technically one piece of carbon, the space is there, which makes these paddles feel much softer than the average thermoform paddle. But that's not the full story, and we'll get way more into that in a second. But first, let me finish up with the specs. This is where the R2 Nova is drastically different to the R1 and R3 Novas. Those are 16.5-inch elongated paddles. This is a 16-inch wide body paddle with a 5.5-inch handle. This is a shape that's become very popular recently because it has a longer handle than more standard 16-inch paddles, which means you can put two hands for a two-handed backhand, and it also makes it more maneuverable because there's less paddle face. So dynamic playability in a wide body long handle shape. It's directly competing with paddles like the Honolulu Pickleball J3K, the Volair Mach 2 Forza, and of course the R2 Pulsar FX, which has similar tech to the Nova. On the Pulsar FX, that grid pattern is actually worked into the whole paddle, not just the edges, so it is a bit more intense, and I'll refer back to that paddle throughout this review. Quickly finishing up with the specs, the R2 Nova weighs 7.9 ounces, has a 106 swing weight with a 6.59 twist weight, and of course a raw Toray T700 carbon top sheet. Now let's talk about some playability. Of course, the main question with any of these adaptive paddles is how do they perform in terms of their power to control ratio. That's the main thing here, their ability to be elite in both, and that's definitely the case with the R2 Nova. Let's start with control. The grid pattern technology makes it so that when you are trying to slow down your stroke, going for more control-oriented touch shots, the paddle provides a very flexible feel. This applies to dinks, drops, and resets. You get more dwell time than on any Gen 2 thermoform paddle, and actually more than on Kevlar paddles too. Kevlar provides this very subtle plush feel that raw carbon doesn't. It becomes very obvious and quite addictive once you have gotten used to it, but the grid pattern softness is much more in your face right off the bat. It's almost as soft as paddles that came before thermoforming. I'm talking the original carbon paddles or even the OG Yola Hyperion. But because it's made from a unibody construction, it has a more responsive feel to it. So soft control is great on all the Novas, but specifically the R2 may be the best control paddle out of all of them because of this shape. For one, the wider paddle face makes it very forgiving, which means you can get easily dialed into the soft game, especially when you're dinking up at the net. You don't always have to make perfect contact, the paddle will bail you out, and the shorter shape is also great for adding a bit of variety to your game. Shorter means more maneuverable, and in the soft game you can use that maneuverability to deceive your opponent. It makes it easier to feign one way then quickly switch to the other direction, and that's even better when you have a softer paddle like this because you have longer dwell time to do all that. Really, I think the R2 Nova is one of the best paddles in the soft game right now. It's almost the perfect storm of all the things that make a paddle perform well for control. The only wide body paddles that I think are a level above it are the Control Air Epic, the Fat Boy, and the R2 Pulsar FX. Now the big question here is, great, the grid pattern technology provides some extra softness, but does that also mean it lacks top-end power? On the Pulsar FX, definitely a little bit. Because it has significantly more of the technology than the Nova, it's noticeably softer, but then also not as rigid when you do want to go big. Here, as you swing faster, the dwell time gets shorter, and eventually you hit this sort of wall that pushes back on the ball, and it actually feels more powerful than a more standard thermoform paddle. That little pushback is something I don't really get on the Pulsar FX, and I think it comes from combining the grid pattern technology on the edges with the more standard carbon layup on the top sheets. It's a unique sensation that makes the Nova extremely competitive in terms of both power and pop, up there with Kevlar paddles, and significantly more than those control paddles I just compared it to. So I'm going to give it a 93 for control and a 91 for power and pop. I do think control is slightly better, but only because this shape lends itself better to the control game. So it is one of the best dynamic paddles right now, but you do have to get used to the way it adapts to different types of shots, and that's not quite as easy as on some other paddles. There is a very stark difference in the way the paddle feels when you make soft contact versus when you hit it hard. Even on Kevlar paddles, that plush feel is subtle, and that extra little spring they provide when you do start to hit hard, it's not a totally different sensation to the way the paddle feels when you're not swinging hard. On the Nova, if you drive one shot then dink the next, you'll notice a very different feel with how the ball comes off the paddle face. That softness is super plush, almost hollow, and that firmer feel is not as firm as Gen 2 thermoform paddles, but that hollowness is completely gone. That stark difference can be a bit weird and definitely takes some time to get used to. Once you start to master it though, you'll realize that it actually is a smooth transition between soft and firm. It's not like there's something magically in the paddle making it randomly decide to firm up at some point, but it's not as easy of a transition point as Kevlar. So at first the paddle may be a little bit ambiguous, but this is something you're going to get used to. At this point, I have a complete understanding of how it responds to different types of shots. I'm going to give it an 89 for feel. It's definitely this paddle's weakest point, but overall it's still great because it has that responsive thermoform feel. Okay, now bear with me with spin because I'm going to try and explain how this paddle stacks up compared to the best spin paddles on very specific shots, because it's excellent in the spin game, but some areas are better than others. Spin is good on drives, but not up there with the best. This shouldn't be too surprising. This is a 16-inch paddle, so it doesn't have the same leverage as elongated paddles, which means it doesn't have the same top-end spin potential. Still, this long handle, wide body shape is much better than the more standard 16-inch paddles because the shorter face makes the whole paddle feel much whippier. This means that it responds better to wrist pronation, so you can really flick the ball at the paddle more efficiently. Again, it won't result in the same amount of spin potential as an elongated paddle, but it feels very spin friendly. I do think it's also a slight notch under shorter Kevlar paddles for spin. The firmer response means you don't crush into the ball as much, so you don't have as much purchase over it for spin. This is a super small difference though. I really had to actively think about it to feel it. The bottom line is this is a very good paddle for spin on drives, but that's not where it shines the most. Soft spin shots. This paddle might be the best I've used in the soft spin game, and that's because it is so soft, but also has that snappier, ultra-responsive feel of a thermoform paddle. You feel so much control over how much spin you can put on the ball during dwell time. It really is awesome, and it allows you to play around and develop the soft spin game as a real weapon. Once you really understand this paddle, you feel like you can almost combine a normal drop with a spin shot, where you start by placing it where you want it to, and then right at the end of your swing, you brush up to hit with spin. Good luck to your opponent trying to pick up those shots. A drop that springs up off the ground because you added spin to it is basically impossible to get, and that's where this paddle shines. Now, Kevlar paddles are also elite in the soft spin game, but the R2 Nova has them beat for me only because they are a little bit softer, so that longer dwell time gives you even more time to grab at the ball. So I'm going to give it a 94 for spin. If I were to split it between soft spin and spin on drives, I'd go 97, 91. Both are great, but it is noticeably better in the soft spin game, so if that's an important part of your game, this could be the paddle for you. This is another one of those extremely well-rounded all-court paddles that's made for players who prefer the more maneuverable and user-friendly feel of wide-body paddles over that of elongated paddles. It may be a little bit more difficult than average, but once you nail that transition point from soft to firm, it has a huge range of playability on either side of the power and control spectrum. I actually think this R2 shape is maybe the best for what the Nova's technology represents, because the soft spin game is where it shines the most, and that's where these long-handle wide-body paddles are at their best. If you're an advanced player who relies on finesse, touch, and you like tapping into that soft spin game, this is one of the best paddles out there for you right now, and the fact that it's also elite in power means it won't limit you from anywhere around the court. I'm a huge fan. It's not a paddle I would switch to because I'm still too reliant on the playability of elongated paddles, but if I were to switch to a shorter paddle, this would be the one. I think a lot more people should take a look at the Novas. I know this technology isn't as flashy as Kevlar, but it's just as good and different enough to where it's worth comparing when you do demo. With that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you do want to demo the R2 Nova or any of the Novas, you can come visit us in store, and if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.